For many of us, seeing the beauty in other people, being kind and compassionate towards other people, that comes pretty easily. But what's really hard is seeing the beauty in ourselves and being kind and compassionate consistently towards ourselves, especially when difficult things happen. Perhaps someone's critical of us, or we make a mistake. We beat up on ourselves. You could call it the inner critic, or that voice in the head that says mean things, or you could call it self-hatred. What can we do in these circumstances to interrupt this cycle and learn to befriend ourselves consistently? Sounds True has created the Self-Acceptance Project to investigate this question. We've invited the participation of spiritual teachers, psychologists, neuroscientists, visionary writers, all to look at how can we learn to be kind and compassionate towards ourselves on a consistent basis. Thank you for joining us, and welcome. In this episode, I speak with Friedemann Schaub, a physician specializing in cardiology and molecular biology, who believes the subconscious mind holds the keys to accelerated healing and well-being. With Sounds True, Friedemann has released the book The Fear and Anxiety Solution and an online course titled Become Unstuck. Friedemann, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be a part of this project. It's very much needed and wonderful that you have put this into motion.
I'd love to know from your perspective, somebody who works quite a bit with helping people access what might be going on in their subconscious mind and how the subconscious might play a role in our behavior. What's your view of why people are so mean to themselves, let's just put it right the way it is, so often? What's going on?
Well, first of all, I think it's amazing that people are more aware of how mean they are to themselves, because I think 5-10 years ago, it was more this undercurrent, or we were just not noticing it or accepting it as, well, this is how we talk to ourselves. Now, actually, there is an awareness of, I wouldn't talk to my best friend like this. So that's definitely a positive. But the problem is when we hear this mean inner voice, of course, we feel like that there is something wrong with us, that somehow there must be someone or something inside of me that has a really bad opinion about me, and we are starting to fight ourselves. We are starting to go in these cycles where we either ignore this voice or we get angry at this voice and we say, shut up or delete, or we are buying into it and then let ourselves be, brought down or feel stuck in the tracks. And what really happens on a subconscious level, I believe, is that this voice has a meaning. And the meaning is not to hurt us. The meaning is not to try us to feel bad about ourselves, but the meaning is ultimately to protect us. And when you really walk through the things you say to yourself, when you really listen to this voice, you may actually hear sometimes that these are echoes of the past. Maybe these are things that you have heard when you were little. Maybe these are things that you actually were told. And some of my clients actually tell me it's actually exactly the voice of my father or my uncle or my teacher that I'm hearing still ringing inside of me. And so why does our mind, obviously not the intellectual part of our mind, but the deeper part, the subconscious mind, why does the subconscious bring up those voices, those echoes? What's happening there? And the reason is to literally prevent us from having to endure what we have endured before, or what we have been always afraid to endure. So let's say, for example, you have a voice that always criticizes you, that always says, well, this is not good enough. This is something that, should be better. Usually you have then developed early on in your life a pattern, a protective pattern that says only if you're perfect or only if you are performing at the highest level, you are acceptable or you will not criticized or judged. Or maybe there is a voice that says to you, oh no, you shouldn't do this because, people will not like it. So you better stay at home or you better don't even try. That may be a protective pattern of being invisible, because that seems to be much more safe than being seen and being a target for someone. Or maybe there is a voice that always says that, well, are you sure that this person is happy with you? What if you next time, try to please even more? That's the pleaser. That's a pattern that actually also has been designed often early in our lives to also appease others through making sure that they are okay with you and that you are not getting in trouble with them. So when you understand that this meanness is just preemptively trying to prevent you from having to endure this from someone else, you may actually then also have a deeper understanding and maybe compassion for that inner protector, that part of you that really tries so hard to keep you safe.
Now, you're saying that these voices of self-criticism actually have this positive function. They're trying to protect us. But in effect, that's not how these voices operate in our lives. I mean, meaning it doesn't often have a positive impact. I hear a voice that says, you'll never be able to write that book, or you'll never be able to successfully do that. And then it shuts me down and it doesn't have a positive result.
Well, it does have a positive result from the perspective of that part of you that still believes that you're small, that you're vulnerable, that you cannot take care of yourself, that you are not really in a position where you can deal with other people's criticism. So in some ways, you have to see that there is a disconnect between you as the adult and that part of you that often started to exist way back when you were still a child. And that disconnect is really what creates this different perspective on reality. An adult side of you says, I can write a book, I can get a promotion, I can go out dating. But another part of you that doesn't see you as trustworthy, doesn't believe that you really can do all of those things, still holds back to the old beliefs that you're much better off making yourself small or making yourself to all those things I talked about, the pleaser or the perfectionist and so on.
Okay, so I think what you're saying here is really important. How do I, quote unquote, update the file, or how do I start recognizing that I'm not still that small person that my subconscious is communicating that I am? How do I start getting it that I'm this strong, well-resourced adult in whatever situation I'm facing?
Well, you phrase it really well, because on the one hand, you have to actually get it yourself before you're trying to teach it to this part of your subconscious that is still believing that you're small and defenseless or vulnerable. So one of the things that you need to do is just to reflect on yourself and say, okay, me from the adult perspective, what do I know about myself that I actually can believe in, that I can appreciate? How many times have I proved myself that I actually can handle certain situations? And this is where the self-talk comes in, where you not just listen to this negative voice and shut it down or ignore it, and this way create more disharmony inside, but you're actually addressing it. And you're addressing it by looking more behind that curtain of the illusion of not being good enough and really look more at the details that show you what the reality is. Many people generalize in their negative self-talk. Oh, I always fail. Or I will never be able to do that. Or I only had failures in my life, and they don't really look at the specific details that shows them the opposite. And so you have to sit down and imagine that you're talking to someone who is maybe concerned about you or who is scared, and you are convincing that with looking at the positive aspects of yourself, that this is no longer the case and that this is a distortion of your reality. But you cannot just do this intellectually. It doesn't really work if you have this inner debating club in your head. You have to do this also more from a compassionate place, from your heart. And this is where then you are actually going inside, just like in a meditation, and you are starting to visualize who that part of you could be that is still somewhat contracted and scared and worried and still trying to imitate the voices of people that used to feel like a threat to you, and then help that part to feel more comforted and reassured through your positive self-talk. Often I tell people, pull out a picture of your 7 or 8-year-old self, maybe from a time when you knew you were the most insecure or anxious, and simply imagine what that would be like to talk to that little self after you have heard some negative self-talk. And how would you comfort, reassure that part of you? What you're creating is really an inner connection between the adult self and that self that still feels somewhat trapped in the past. And you're building a bridge through this compassion and through also the guidance that looks at reality in a much more wide and positive way. And when I help people to do that in the sessions that I offer to people, within 2 to 3 weeks, their negative self-talk drops by 80%. And that's on average. Some people actually hear no self-talk anymore because they really feel finally that voice that tries to get attention got all the reassurance and all the attention it needed. And there is just silence, which is, of course, a huge relief.
So Friedman, I think just to make this really concrete for people, I wonder if you could share with us an example of someone that you've worked with in your practice who perhaps had a really challenging self-acceptance issue in their life that they were working on, some way that they were really kind of getting in their own way in terms of their own empowerment because of this negative self-talk, and what you worked on together and how the process went.
Well, most clients that I'm working with actually are having trouble with self-acceptance. Like you said, this is certainly an epidemic in many ways. And it is also that most clients realize when they are, after our first session, asked to just simply take note of their self-talk, that they realize how negative it is and how mean it can be. What I think about, for example, is a client who was always very, very successful. All his life he has been just an overachiever. But what happened is that every time he reached a next goal, he questioned himself and he wondered whether he really deserved to be in that position, if he really was good enough. And that fear of feeling like a fraud and being found out any day and losing everything that he has built was just something that became bigger and bigger the higher he climbed and the more successes he had. And at some point he was at that level that he always wanted to be. And that was a time where he got the most severe panic attacks and had insomnia and really was for the first time looking for help. Now, when he looked at his self-talk, he realized that this voice that always tried to simply put him down or tell him, in a doubtful way whether he really is good enough, that voice had been with him since early on in his life, and that he pretty much either ignored this voice or tried just to do even a harder and a better job to outperform these insecurities. When we went back into his childhood and really looked on a subconscious level what the root cause of this voice could be, he realized that as a child, he looked at his father, who was an underachiever, his father who was struggling pretty much all his life just to make ends meet. And he saw the pain and the anxiety and all those limiting beliefs that the father had. And he felt that those beliefs on some level actually had been infusing on him, had been deeply absorbed by his subconscious, but at the same time, he didn't really want to get stuck in them. So, what he developed was, in some ways, two sides. One side that said, you're not good enough, which was something he had learned by example. And he also did have certainly a critical father who did quite frequently judge him and put him down. But then he had the other side that says, no, I'm going to prove myself and I'm going to outperform my whole family and I will be extremely successful. So he had been living in this inner conflict constantly. And the more he reached, the louder the voice of doubt and insecurity became. And of course, he battled himself through life until he was in his mid 40s, until he realized his inner battle was no longer sustainable. So when we went into a subconscious process of reconnecting him to that voice that always was anxious and that always was insecure, we worked on him having actually understanding and compassion for the circumstances this part grew up with. And we helped him to find a language to speak with that part of him so that that part of him didn't have to hold on to those old beliefs, but also to see more that the adult self is trustworthy, has so much resources and capabilities, and that that part of him no longer needs to protect him. That this part no longer needs to look out for his safety, that the adult self can actually be the one who is that source of protection and safety. Now, this sounds all, maybe very simple, and it is. But what happens really is not that the intellectual understanding was enough. What happens is that he was able, through the process of the subconscious, to go actually into his heart. And, this is something that I always feel is so important for self-acceptance, to be able to open your heart to yourself. And when you are able to see that your source, like he did, the source of your negative self-talk, the source of that inner fighting yourself, that source of that mainly or maybe meanness that you have been experiencing, that source is actually a part of you that needs this reassurance and needs compassion, you will notice that there is an enormous shift happening because you are understanding that you're actually outgrowing your past. And this is exactly what happened with this client. He was able to outgrow the past that he tried to run away from, that he tried to outachieve himself from all his life. And all of a sudden, he actually was able to enjoy his accomplishments. He was able to enjoy his life, and he found a much greater peace and again, a much greater compassion for himself.
That's a wonderful story, Friedman. I think it really illustrates a situation that many of us in some form might feel ourselves in. So a couple questions. You emphasized the heart, opening the heart, and being able to relate to this younger part of ourselves from the heart. How do we do that?
Often our heart is already open, just not to ourselves. I had really countless women that I worked with that came from abusive relationships, that only once the husband was actually laying hand on the children or was yelling at the children, they found the strength to move out of those relationships and finally separate themselves. When that was done to them, they simply accepted it and didn't do anything about it. So that compassion and that concern and that love for the children then brought them into a better place to finally protect themselves and protect the family. And so what I'm saying here is that we often, whether we are parents, whether we have good friends, or whether you just have a pet that you really, really love dearly, there is an ability for us to have compassion and openness that is innate, that is already there. What we don't necessarily know is how to turn it towards ourselves and how to give that warmth and that love and that healing energy to ourselves. And this is where this connection to a younger self can be so eye-opening and heart-opening, because we all can have love and compassion for a child, especially when we realize what a child went through. I worked with a client that really, really had a lot of negative self-talk towards herself. And when she recognized as a child how much she actually tried to protect her mother from the pain that her mother had, how much she tried to shield her heart by pleasing her, by making sure the mother was okay, even at an early age, she actually gained a complete new level of admiration and love for that younger self by realizing how much courage and strength and compassion she already had at that young age. And so revisiting your childhood, and often it's really helpful to do this in a subconscious process, and realizing that your greatness and your ability to love and have compassion was already there, and that self that may have simply felt not safe enough to unfold and expand needs now exactly that level of compassion and love from you, the adult. That in itself is really heart opening, and as something that it's a huge step towards to feeling whole and feeling in harmony with yourself.
Now, there's two other parts of the example that you gave of this high-achieving client that I want to pull out a bit. So the first was you talked about how this person responded to the parental environment as a child. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about how you see that in general. Often people do this. We're responding as young children to our parents, and how that influences our own sense of ourself, and how you see that kind of getting encoded, if you will, in our subconscious.
Well, in this case, he basically had two protective strategies or patterns developed to respond to the environment. One was to put himself down so that he may avoid criticism, but the other one was also to get stronger and better and prove himself that he is actually able and capable of reaching the goals and proving the parents wrong and stepping out of those constricting footsteps of the parents. That often happens, that we are having two sides that are either simultaneously or one after another develop on the subconscious level. For me, for example, I certainly was, as a child, at first pretty easygoing and happy-go-lucky until I had my first few big failures in school, and the teachers raised concern to my parents, and they, of course, raised concern back to me, not necessarily in the most compassionate way. And in that moment, it was almost like a shock for me that world that seemed to be so safe and so accepting completely changed and all of a sudden appeared so judgmental and demanding. And I had two also, in some ways, responses to this. One response was a response of hypervigilance and a response of really making sure all the ducks are in a row. But then there was also a part that really felt very unsafe and insecure, and was not really daring to start something new, not confident enough, and felt like the best thing is to hide out and not really put yourself into danger. So there was definitely a part that wanted to contract and a part that wanted to perform so that other people are pleased. Both parts try to simply make sure that I'm safe and don't get hurt. And so you can probably look at your negative self-talk and you may be able to see that you not only have one source of negative messages, but there may be two sources. Very frequently, I notice that these two sources start, one early in life and the second maybe when you're a teenager. Maybe there is a source that feels more rebellious or feels more like, I just going to do it my own way. And that may be a complete different energy in that part of your negative self-talk than the part that was earlier developed, that was maybe more about protection through invisibility or protection through avoidance. So it may be really interesting for you to not only look at those different voices, but also then imagine and visualize and communicate with those different parts at the different age they are at, but keeping in mind that you have the responsibility as the loving, compassionate adult to guide and direct these part of your subconscious back into the wholeness of the now.
Which brings me to the other question that I wanted to ask from the story that you described of your client. You said that he learned to speak differently to these parts of himself, that there was sort of an inner language. Can you talk more about that?
Well, first of all, he became much kinder. Rather than getting harsh and demanding and judgmental with himself, he actually, became much more like a parental figure himself to those parts of him. So it was interesting because he had two children that were also fairly young, and he noticed that he had been quite demanding to those children, that he had been rather pushy and critical. And as he was learning to empathize and also be more compassionate to his own inner younger self, he was actually also changing how he talked to his own children. So it's about, of course, the words you're using. It's also about the energy you put into the words. It's about the patience you have with yourself. And it's about the consistency. When you are communicating with a child, you cannot just say something one time and expect it's going to happen. So you have to be patient and you have to be committed to helping that child to grow into whatever you see is the best for that child. And that's the same with that inner voice that seems to be still trapped in, your past. Just allow yourself to have that compassion, the consistency, and the commitment to communicate. Often communication doesn't even have to be verbal. It can be also very visual, internal visual, where you're simply holding that child, where you actually feel how it must feel to have that child in your arms and simply comfort that child. That in itself, that sensation is a heart opening. See, on a subconscious level, it doesn't matter what actually is real and what you imagine. So if you're imagining that you're holding your younger self and giving it comfort and really simply to your presence, giving it a sense of safety, your subconscious is actually rewriting your history. It's rewriting your past and is resolving the pattern. And that's certainly one of the most powerful aspects of the subconscious.
I wonder if you have any suggestions for a technique that someone could use on the spot, like they suddenly find themselves starting to spiral down, how they could interrupt that downward spiral of negative self-talk right in the moment.
Well, I love the negative self-talk exercise that I have described in the book, The Fear and Anxiety Solution, and I certainly think this is something we can really use on the spot. Now, what's important though is that you don't do this only one time and do it like a bailout anchor that says, okay, now I'm just going to address myself in this moment when I'm the most desperate, but that you're actually creating a consistent relationship. Ultimately, what you do deal with when you have this negative self-talk or when you do have these spirals of negative thinking is that you don't really relate to all of you very well, and building relationship means you have to be there and you have to be consistently able to communicate. But when you do have one of those moments where you just spiral out, Often it may be that you have actually just a feeling, that you just feel super anxious or really, really worried, and you don't even know what you're thinking. You just have a feeling. It's kind of that what really shakes you up. So the first step would be simply to ask yourself what the feeling is, and then simply continue with, I am, whatever the feeling is. Let's say I am anxious because, and then just let come up what comes up. It's very interesting to notice that these thoughts, these spiraling thoughts, are like little bubbles from the depth of your subconscious. You don't even have to think about them, they're just there. And just by paying attention, stopping, listening to it, you already know, okay, now I'm actually connected to that inner self that needs attention. You listen to the thought, you may even write it down, and then you ask yourself the three questions that are really stopping this spiral right there. It's like the reality check question. And the first question is that really true? Good question. Because sometimes you may say, yeah, it is true. I really feel like a failure. Or, yeah, it is true. I'm going to lose my job. But then you say, telling yourself that you do fail or that you will lose your job, is that really serving you right now? Is that really helping you to feel better or reach your goals? And obviously the answers are no. And in that moment, there is already an inner jolt where you simply take the reins back and you're saying, okay, it's not serving me, so I'm not entertaining that thought. I'm not going down in this spiral. Let's redirect the thinking. And that redirection is then about the three positive things you can say to yourself that are counterbalancing this negative statement. So for example, I'm a failure. You could say, no, I have succeeded in many things. And then you get a little bit more specific in what you have succeeded. Or you can talk about the potential that you have. Or you can talk about how maybe other people have consistently supported and appreciated you for X, Y, and Z. So you can be very creative. And what you need to do, though, as you are in that positive mindset, as I said before, you need to really be in a place where you feel something, where you do have a sense of compassion and understanding. And that usually really happens only if you do look, especially at the beginning, at the source of that negative self-talk as a younger self that just needs a little attention and needs support. Now, what often happens is that maybe the next thought comes up, and you simply do this again. You just stop yourself, ask those three questions, but after 4 or 5, you will notice there is a shift happening because you're piling up much more evidence on that positive energy level and the positive thoughts than you have in the negative thought. And the spiral basically stops. The spiral loses momentum. And there is a sense of inner peace that you will get in that moment. It's very powerful, and it's something that I feel is really the one of the most effective bridges to starting the work with the subconscious mind.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Friedemann. I just have one final question for you. We started this conversation talking about how we're in a certain moment of time in our cultural zeitgeist where this whole topic of self-compassion and self-acceptance seems to be prevalent in our collective dialogue in a way that it hasn't been previously. And I'm just curious to know why you think that is. Why do you think that's the case right now in time?
Well, I have a feeling that we have been so trained to look at the outside of us, to basically see ourselves in relation to others, to compare ourselves, to compete with others, to somehow see our own worthiness only through the measurements and the perspectives and the opinions of others, that we have lost touch with ourselves, that there is something inside of us that just felt more and more pulled out of the center. And I have the feeling that this is, has been going on for, decades now, and it has been certainly accelerated more and more through the media, through new pressures and new ways of communication that prevents us more and more from actually taking the time and recenter ourselves and even get a relationship to ourselves. But what happens is that whether we call it our core, our essence, our heart, our soul, whatever you want to call it, but on a deeper level, on a deeper consciousness level, this is a state that's not acceptable. Because if you're not connected to yourself, you will never learn to know yourself, and you will never learn what you're actually here for. What is actually the purpose of your being? Is the purpose of your being just to fit in or to compete or to win or to compare with others? Or is your purpose something very unique and individual? And I believe that this tendency for people now to notice more and have the desire to connect more to themselves comes from the pain of the disconnection, the pain of being outside of yourself, of not feeling yourself. And I'm not a person who is avoiding pain. I think pain is something very healing, and it's certainly something that can be a catalyst for growth. And I think as a society, having this level of pain, the level of anxiety, the level of depression that is going around, I believe that's actually a huge catalyst for growth on a bigger level. And I'm glad that like yourself and like this program, there are let's say guidance out there for people to find a way to reconnect and find a way to learn that actually they need to have a relationship with himself in order to find the peace and also the fulfillment that we are all looking for.
Always good to talk to you. Friedman, Schaub, you always have something so helpful and uplifting and real. Gritty, real, helpful, uplifting to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Friedman Schaub is a physician specializing in cardiology and molecular biology and has helped many clients overcome fear and anxiety with his breakthrough empowerment programs that combine his medical expertise with clinical hypnotherapy, meditation, NLP, timeline therapy, and more. With Sounds True, Dr. Schaub has released the book, The Fear and Anxiety Solution, and an audio program of the same title that includes many of the guided practices that are included in the book. You can visit SoundsTrue.com for more on Dr. Friedman's work. SoundsTrue.com. Many voices, one journey. Thanks for listening.